So, good morning, all of you. It gives me great delight to be in your midst after 17 years. Yeah, 17 years have gone by since I first met you. And if my friend Prakash is to be believed, the only change that has come over to me in the last 17 years is that my headline has receded further. But our friendship is half century old, and so he can't be possibly wrong. But I distinctly recall that when I first met you, I had an occupation to hang on to. But of late, I joined the legion of unemployed youth in Kerala. Again, unemployment is all-time high in the last 40 years in India. Still, India is said to be poised to become the third largest economy in the world. Suniye, Modi ji, suniye. So, we are here to recall the life and times of Franz Kafka. Kafka was a little known writer, a Czech writer residing in the city of Prague when he died on 3rd of June in 1925. He had just a couple of his short stories published at that time. In fact, he wanted all his writings to be burned. That was the command, rather, not death wish, but command that he gave his close friend Max Brod. But Max Brod chose to disobey him, consciously chose to disobey him. And now we have most of his unfinished novels, novellas, parables, letters, and diaries intact before us. I recall an interesting piece written by Borges on this episode. A man who is in the deathbed asking his friend not to publish his works, to burn them altogether. Borges makes the strange case that his friend must have known that he didn't seriously mean it. And the man who gave this, dying wish, he also had in mind a lurking hope that his manuscripts won't be burned. So it was a kind of arranged game. That's a mischievous interpretation given by Borges to this famous last wish of Franz Kafka. So he was a little known writer. Again, this year happens to be the 100th year of the publication of Magic Mountain, written by Thomas Mann, Kafka's great contemporary. We'll have occasion to touch on the relationship between Kafka and Mann soon. But what followed was tragic news. His sisters ended up in Hitler's concentration camp. His house was demolished. Last year, as I visited Prague, I had the opportunity to see the fragment of his demolished house. Only a fragment remains. And opposite to that, there is the Kafka Museum. It's my enduring regret that I was not able to enter the museum, because the morons who formed the group, I moved with a group. They hadn't heard about Kafka. They were eager to catch the boat ride along the river of Danube. So I had to follow suit. So I missed that great opportunity to visit the Kafka Museum, where the original letter written by Kafka addressed to his father is still displayed. Okay. So his reputation solidified in the years to come. But before that, he was banned in Hitler's Germany. He was banned in Stalinist Russia. There was a period of neglect and ban. But then slowly his posthumous reputation began to rise. And his books became bestsellers. His diaries were published, his parables, then his letters addressed to two of his lovers, Felice and Dora, were published. So steadily Kafka became a cult figure, an iconic figure, perhaps the single most influence on 20th century literature. And the funniest part is that I deliberately chose this caption, Kafka Mystery, because one of the mysteries surrounding Kafka is that we are yet to know what Kafka truly meant by his writings. The entire mystery circles around the question what he really meant by his writings. There is hardly any literary school which has not claimed Kafka as its forefather, starting with expressionists, Dadaists, Surrealists, Existentialists, Absurdists, Structuralists. All of them had claimed Kafka as their spiritual forefather. Kafka can't be all these things in one go. Simultaneously, he can't be all these things. But Kafka meant a lot to each of these succeeding generation in European literary history. Starting with expressionists, of course, he was in one sense, an expressionist. A man turning into a beetle, into a giant insect, is a characteristic expressionistic device. But he was much more than that. And the existentialists and absurdists look back on him as an inspiring figure. As Sartre and Camus chose to project their nihilistic sense of a despairing void in the universe, they hark back to Kafka. Both Camus and Sartre have written about Kafka. Even though Camus' evaluation of Kafka is a bit muted, he slightly disapproved of Kafka's negativity and pessimism. Again, his sense of cosmic absurdity, that was seized by the absurdists. So in this way, Kafka's reputation solidified in the years that followed. And the greatest tribute to him came from W.H. Auden, the one-time Marxist poet who later became a humanist and a Christian with a Christian orientation. This is the most quoted comment by W.H. Auden. If I were to name a writer who stands in the same relationship to our century as Dante did to his, Shakespeare did to his, and Goethe to his, the name that would come to my mind is that of Franz Kafka. If I were to name a writer who stands in the same relationship to our century as Dante did to his, Shakespeare to his, and Goethe to his, the name that would come to my mind is that of Franz Kafka. That's the highest tribute that has been showered on Franz Kafka. Of course, this is a mid-century evaluation, but I think that evaluation still stands good. He influenced, succeeding generations of writers. Gabriel Garcia Marquez has openly said that he wouldn't have become a writer if he had not read the Metamorphoses. Metamorphoses, like Leo Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich, written late 19th century, has been considered as one of the greatest short stories in 20th century literature. And Metamorphoses has influenced a whole generation of writers. After Kafka turned man into a beetle, it was easier for Ionesco to turn man into a rhinoceros. The whole idea of metamorphosis that originated with Kafka. So, the tribute paid by W.H. Auden is a measure of the vast posthumous reputation of this strange Czech genius who died in virtual obscurity, in virtual anonymity. For one thing, he was shy, hypersensitive, and above everything, he was a perfectionist. He went on chiseling his prose. He went on correcting his writings. He didn't want them to be published because he had an absolute ideal of artistic perfection, which he always thought, he fell short of that. And hence he didn't want his writings to be published. Among his writings, he preferred only 5 short stories. His novels all remain fragmentary, incomplete. Both The Trial and The Castle, and also America are incomplete works. And again, this quality of incompletion or fragmentariness, that goes with Kafka. I mean, this disregard for artistic finish, that again is symptomatic of Kafka's approach to art and literature. He didn't finish these novels partly because, he didn't have the confidence in himself to finish them. He was a person who always used to judge himself rather harshly by absolute standards, and he thought he fell short of those standards. This constant act of self-reviewing, self-criticism, that was ingrained in Kafka. So when Kafka died, he was a relatively unknown writer, and now he has become one of the great bestsellers in the world. Again, Kafka is the most written about writer in the world, next only to Jesus Christ and Hamlet. Three literary figures, the most written about figures in the world. Christ, of course, Hamlet. There is something in common between Hamlet and Kafka, that's another thing. And third, Kafka. There is hardly any world language in which his novels and short stories haven't been translated. He has become an iconic figure, a cult figure, revered, criticized, but still, you can't simply wish away his influence, his perennial, long-lasting, enduring influence on modern and postmodernist fiction. So what really makes this Kafka mystery rather endearing? But what's the meaning of Kafka mystery? Incidentally, he has gifted a new word to English language, as Prakash correctly mentioned, Kafkaesque. Anything that is illogical, bizarre, anything that defies your reason, anything which you feel leads to a trap, anything which cannot be analyzed by reason or logic, we call Kafkaesque. Something inscrutable, incomprehensible, mysterious, we call by the name Kafkaesque. That has become an accepted phrase in English language, literary criticism, like Orwellian. So he has gifted an adjective to English language. Critics speak of the Kafka problem, the Kafka mystery. A book on Kafka is entitled The Terror of Art. Writings on Kafka can fill whole libraries in Prague. How come that? This is something, unprecedented in the entire history of world literature. A writer who died in virtual obscurity, emerging as a cult figure, exercising a dominant influence on the generations to come. But that is what has happened in the case of Franz Kafka. To start with, he was a German-speaking Jew living in the city of Prague. In another sense, he was doubly exiled. And let's have a look at his social background and family background. He was a Jew. He grew up in a tightly structured Jewish family under a father who was domineering, rather harsh with him, and who was absolutely impervious to his literary aspiration. Critics have pinned down upon Kafka's negative father obsession, his indubitably strained relationship with his father. And here was a person who, at the age of 30, wrote a long letter to his father, which was undelivered. He didn't have the courage to deliver that letter to his father. In that letter, he makes a strange confession. All my writings are about you. My writings constitute a protracted act of leave-taking from you. All my writings are about you. My writings constitute a protracted act of leave-taking from you. And he had his reason for He grows against his father. His father was the son of a butcher, a very robust person, physically strong. And Kafka, that letter, that harrowing letter says, you sat in your armchair and you ruled over the world. You were strong, robust, well built, but I was pale, sickly. That physical contrast, that was what emotionally affected him most, between the physically strong, virile, domineering, authoritarian father and this pale, sickly child. If you allow a slight diversion, you have a version of this Kafka's situation in one of the Indian movies, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, called 27 Down. 27 Down. It's about a young man who wanted to be an artist, but whose father, his domineering father, who was a railway employee, didn't allow him to choose his path in life. In that film, that hero's role played by Raina, the theatre actor, and the father was a well-known Hindi actor. Therein you find the contrast between the physical shape of the son and the father. The father, who has lost one of his legs in a railway accident, he looks so robust, strongly built. And Raina at that time was a small figure, rather inconspicuous figure, with a sad face, the sad smile. 27 Down is one film which consciously or unconsciously pays tribute to Franz Kafka. It's based on a Hindi novel written by Ramesh Bakshi. I do believe that, Bakshi was decisively influenced by Kafka in writing this novel. Again, he also drank himself to death, Ramesh Bakshi. And 27 Down became a cult film, but then before he received the news of the national award, the director, he got himself drowned at the Juhu beach in Bombay. Of course, he was into drugs, and there was his wife had left him, he had a female companion, they had a scuffle, and she jumped into the sea, he tried to save her, and he drowned himself. Rajakrishnan Kaul. Well, that's another part of the story. This distinctly Kafka's touch in that film, I was trying to recall. So Kafka grew up in a family ruled over by an authoritarian father. Again, there was a sense of unreality about the times around him. The tightly structured Jewish family which followed closely Jewish customs, Jewish rituals. But then something happened at that time which again went into the shaping of Kafka's worldview. That was the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what's called the Habsburg monarchy. At that time, institutions like the court, or all the bureaucratic institutions, they were all melting and dissolving before his very eyes. Kafka saw this disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which provided some kind of security and anchorage to thousands of people in Europe over long years. And Kafka directly participated in the working of the bureaucracy. He began as a clerk in a national insurance company for workers' accident. He worked there for 13 years. So he made a close first-hand study of the working of bureaucracy, the Byzantine bureaucracy, the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Perhaps these two things, went into the making of his worldview, the parental tyranny and the decadent bureaucracy. Perhaps, this father figure and the decadent bureaucracy fused into an ominous image of authority with capital A in Kafka's short stories and novels. In all his novels and short stories, you have this recurrent theme, somewhere the connection is lost. It was E.M. Foster who said, only connect. But in Kafka's world, you only have the disconnect. There is somewhere the disconnect between the self and the world, between the self and the outer world, between the individual and the social organization. There is a huge disconnect. If you analyze his novellas and parables, you will come across this obsessive theme. For example, there is a parable by Kafka entitled The Emperor's Message. Seemingly, the parable is set in China of olden times. An emperor passes on a dying wish to a messenger to be passed on to the people. The emperor dies. The point is, the messenger is unable to move out to the palace and deliver the message to the people. There is the inner court, there is the outer court, there are the galleries, the chambers, the galleries. He will never be able to cross all these obstacles. He will never be able to deliver the message, because you have these impediments, these hurdles, these obstacles in the way. So the message is lost, because the messenger never can hope to cross all these hurdles and pass on the message to the people. Likewise, there is another parable named Before the Law. Before the Law. There is a doorkeeper in the building named Law, and a person tries to enter into that building. He makes every effort to enter it, but he is never allowed entry. And towards the end of the parable, he asks the doorkeeper, but so many people have tried to enter this place, nobody has ever succeeded. Why? Then the doorkeeper suddenly shuts the door of the place. He is forever denied entry into it. This is a recurrent concern with Kafka, what he called the hiatus, the gap between the individual and the social organization, between man and the outer world. And this is central to his novel, considered a masterpiece, perhaps his latest novel, The Castle. Where have K going in search of the castle. He tries to bribe the women who are associated with the castle. He makes every attempt. He uses all ploys, to get entry into the castle. But when the novel ends, he still has to wait. He goes after clues, but some of the clues are quite misleading. What the castle represents, what it really signifies, is left deliberately vague, deliberately uncertain. Some critics have interpreted the novel as a reverse of Pilgrim's Progress. A Christian parable about a man's search for grace and redemption. The fact remains that the castle in Kafka's novel is a seedy one, it's a decadent one. It's full of ominous signs. It's infested with evil, and all the signals it sends out are not at all positive. And K, again, two of his heroes are named Joseph K and K. They are the shortened versions of Kafka himself. Before his death, a friend asked Kafka, how did you want to end that novel? Would K ever gain his admittance into the castle? And Kafka gave a tentative answer. Yeah, finally he would be able to enter the castle. At that time he was dying. You think of the novel like The Trial. A novel like The Trial. Somebody must have been telling stories about Joseph K. so that one fine morning he was arrested. Which are the mysterious agencies which are persecuting? which arrest him and make him go through a protracted process of investigation and trial. And what is his crime? What is his guilt? Of course, critics with a Christian bent of mind have said that, it's about original sin. That's a purely Christian interpretation of Kafka. One valid way of reading Kafka, but not the final one. There are critics who believe that this is a veiled account of Kafka's struggle with his illness, tuberculosis. That the arrest and trial of Joseph K. represent the 5 different stages of the growth of tuberculosis. Again, the strangest part of the novel is that Kafka had prophesied about the coming of Nazi regime through this novel. The farcical trials, the trumped up charges, the farcical trials, and arrest for an unspecified crime. All these things form part of the national reality in Nazi Germany. Again, interestingly enough, Kafka was turned into a chip in the Cold War game. Both the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc tried to pitch in Kafka to support their argument. The Marxist critics tried to portray Kafka as symptomatic of the decadence in the Western capitalist society. In fact, the conservative Marxist critic of the 19th century, late 19th century, he also lived in 20th century, Gorgi Lukács has written a controversial essay titled Kafka or Thomas Mann, Thomas Mann or Kafka, where he says that Mann is health and Kafka is illness. You have to choose between health and illness. But even that's a debatable proposition because, man's magic mountain, that's been called the apotheosis of illness in modern fiction. The entire novel is set in a sanatorium. The novel contains, huge discussions on the question of the polarities of health and illness. Kafka is sickness, Mann is health. So you have to choose between. That was the contention of Gorgi Lukács. So Kafka became a kind of ploy he died in 1924 in the Cold War. Whereas Western critics point out that, a novel like Trial captured the true nature of the show trials of Stalin, the purges, the fabricated, a trial under fabricated charges which became a feature of Stalinist Russia. So he was a bone of contention for both the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc during the Cold War. Still, his writings continue to elude a definitive answer. What he really meant by his writings, that still remains a mystery. Nobody has ever been able to unlock that mystery because he has been seen from different perspectives, from different multiple viewpoints, that what he truly meant by his writings still remain somewhat of a mystery. But again, if you have read his diaries, diaries and his letters addressed to 2 of his lovers, Felice and Dora, you catch a glimpse of his emotional states. Here was a man who, as a biographer pointed out, was secretly coughing blood in a remote corner of his house while the First World War was raging on outside. You come across only a brief mention on the advent of First World War in Kafka's diaries. Today the World War started. That's the only comment that you come across in Kafka's diaries. But there was Kafka who felt his literary aspirations stifled by his mundane bureaucratic job, who was tubercular from his early days, fighting with fatigue, with boredom, with tiredness, secretly coughing blood while the family gathering took place in another part of the house. He always wanted to hide within himself, the bruise that went into his soul, his personal traumas, he wanted to hide from the outer world. But then in his diaries, he pours out his agony. He pours out that howl of pain sometimes rises to a crescendo in his diaries. He was he didn't have proper sleep. He was an insomniac. And this is the interesting observation he makes about his insomnia. I am memory come alive, and hence my insomnia. I am memory come alive, and hence my insomnia. Again, a passing entry in his diaries. Again, in the course of a routine description of what happened on that day, Kafka suddenly makes this arresting observation. But I cannot love, I am far away, I am banished. I cannot love, I am far away, I am banished. This piercing cry, occurs as part of a rather prosaic description of what happened on that day. Suddenly he becomes conscious about his own predicament. I cannot love, I am far away, I am banished. And this is one of the most well quoted entries from his diary. All is imaginary, family, friends, the streets, all imaginary, far away or close at hand, the woman, all of them are imaginary. The truth is that man is beating, the truth is that you are beating your head against the wall of a windowless and doorless cell. You are beating your head against the walls of a windowless and doorless cell. Here he almost poignantly sums up his predicament, the ultimate isolation of the human self. Man devoid of spiritual anchorage, man with a disinherited mind, seen as beating his head against a doorless and windowless cell. That nearly sums up, the picture of the world that's communicated through Kafka's world. There is another observation contained in Kafka's diaries, which gives some serious food for thought. All of you are aware of the time theme in modern literature, themes of time and memory. Numerous articles and books have been written about the time cycles, time structures in modern fiction. You come across, titles like Time and a Modern Novel, Time in 10 Modern Novels. Because time or transience is a perennial theme in modern fiction. But again, Kafka, who was not a theorist, who was far from being a literary critic, has scribbled these lines. It's impossible to sleep, impossible to wake up, impossible to bear the course of life. The clocks don't match. The clocks don't match. The inner one moves at a demonic or inhuman pace, while the outer one moves at its accustomed pace. That single observation, the clocks don't match. The inner and the outer clocks are at dissonance. That nearly sums up, all that has been written by way of theory or analysis about the time theme in modern literature. The clocks don't match. The inner one moves on at a devilish or rather inhuman pace, while the outer one moves at its accustomed speed. What else can happen but that the two worlds split apart? And they do split apart, or at least clash in a fearful manner. The inner and the outer world split apart and clash in a frightening manner. Many of us suffer from insomnia, but nobody, I think, has theorized it without being conscious of it in this fashion. And that is the real power and relevance of the the near prophetic powers that Kafka wielded. He was not a prophet. He didn't want to be seen as a prophet. An insignificant man, a clerk in an insurance company who was shy of social company, and who broke up two of his engagements. Again, critics have drawn scenes of parallels in the lives of Franz Kafka and the 19th century philosopher Kierkegaard, the author of books like Sickness Unto Death, Fear and Trembling. Kierkegaard influenced Kafka in a seminal fashion, and there were some parallels in their contact points in their lives. Kierkegaard, again lacking confidence, broke off his engagement with Regina. Likewise, Kafka broke off his engagement with two of his girlfriends. On the one hand, he wanted to get married, lead a normal life, but somewhere there was the diffidence, that sense of emotional insecurity which pulled him back. He thought that marriage would interfere with his literary activity. A writer should be solitary. A writer should be able to give his entire self to the act of writing. So after this diffidence, after this lack of confidence, Kafka broke off his engagements. And critics have noted a parallel between Kierkegaard and Kafka. Actually, Kafka's diaries contain several references to Kierkegaard, whom he considers as a pole star. So, what Kafka actually meant by his writings would always remain a mystery. But still, we can go through his parables and letters and diaries and unfinished manuscripts, unfinished novels and novellas and short fiction to arrive at a sense of how he looked upon the world. Here was a man who saw with uncanny precision the frightening visage of the coming world. That's the Nazi and the Stalinist era, the era of totalitarian regimes. As a Western critic has pointed out, what can be more absurd than the spectacle of Trotsky being assassinated and millions ending up in the concentration camps of Mao and Stalin. There is a counterpoint to the Soviet or the Eastern Bloc's reading of Kafka. Kafka saw with uncanny precision the nature of the world, what you call the apocalypse, that truly arrived soon after his death. He died in 1924, and soon after, Germany was overtaken by Nazism. So the acute precision with which, he examined the malaise of the 20th century at an early stage, that is something which has caught the attention of critics and literary historians. What really gave him this prophetic insight into the times to come, Not that the period in which he lived was a stable period. There were, signs of unrest, signs of the coming disorder. But then nobody had anticipated such a huge evil like Nazism descending upon Germany. But that was Kafka's remarkable gift for foreseeing the future. So this man who was right from the beginning discouraged, disaffected, denationalized. I told you he was a German-speaking Jew living in the city of Prague. Had in him, his ability to foresee what was to come after his death, what was to overtake the world in the coming decades. And that's where the prophetic power of Kafka's fiction really lies. A man who has left us only unfinished novels, unfinished manuscripts, and a handful of short stories and parables. How come that he has become a cult figure? One of the most written about writers in the history of literature. That is the secret of Kafka's unique appeal. You will never be able to decipher it properly. You can go on reading Kafka, go on reading the secondary source on Kafka, still you will miss out what he really meant by his writings. Then there is the question of his Jewishness. He was a Jew, and he was well versed in Jewish folklore and Jewish mythology. There was a time in his life when he wanted to settle down in Palestine. He told his girlfriend that he really wanted to settle down in Palestine. The Jewish element in Kafka's writings, that's quite prominent, undoubtedly. But then this Jewish element sits uneasy with his other preoccupations. On the other hand, he had this pessimism, this lack of confidence, And in one of his diaries, he says, we are evil thoughts that came into the head of God. We are evil thoughts that he came into the head of God. So this ultimate pessimism, this nihilistic sense of man falling short of grace and redemption, that was part of Kafka's way of looking at the world. Many critics have, of course, attributed this malaise to what's called the father situation in his life. Maybe that was the root cause of this malaise. A domineering father, unmindful of or even inimical to his son's literary aspirations. The son who tries to, a sickly, pale son trying to pitch himself against a strong and robust father. Maybe that really cast a shadow on his worldview. He was never able to outgrow it. Then there was his physical condition coupled with his emotional state. And then there was a bureaucratic job, which was really antithetical to his literary aspiration. Maybe all these things made Kafka into a neurotic kind of artist. But then his neurosis captured not only elements of life in the present century, but also, what was going to come after his death. So Kafka denies us any easy optimism about life. His writings undercuts any kind of easy optimism about life. There is always the warning. There is something ominous waiting for you. There is something inscrutable which will change the whole pattern of your life. At any moment you can be arrested for fabricated charges, or you will never be able to reach your destination, your goal, as K in the castle realizes. Incidentally, I used to make a personal observation. I always felt that, the right time to read Kafka, a novel or a short story can be read at any part of the day. A novel like Castle can be read only in the twilight hour or during night. Actually, K arrives in the village inn after a late evening. I just can't imagine reading the novel Castle during daytime, in daylight. Because there is something nocturnal about Kafka, nocturnal about the reality portrayed in the Castle, which makes you enjoy that novel, or get into it only when you read it late evening or at night. You can't read VKN during night. VKN is to be read during daytime. So the specific hour of the day you choose for reading a work of art, that also matters. Maybe that's one of my crazy ideas. So Franz Kafka, his reputation still all-time high. Again, Gabriel Garcia Marquez has said that he would never have become a writer if he had not come across the Metamorphosis in his younger days. Undoubtedly considered to be the greatest short story in 20th century fiction. Metamorphosis influenced whole generations of writers and artists to come. In Metamorphosis, Kafka gave expression to his father obsession. Grigor Samsa, who was the breadwinner of the family, who suddenly turned into a huge insect, into a beetle. There he experienced the hostility of his father, and finally he dies by his father's hand. We can interpret it as an expression of Kafka's lurking death wish, as a perennial expression of his latent death wish, his incestuous attraction towards his sister. There are so many elements in this family drama, which are directly taken from Kafka's personal life. It has the purity of a classical Greek tragedy. There are critics who have analyzed this long short story or this novella in terms of a Greek tragedy, 5 parts of a Greek tragedy. It has such lucidity, such classical composure about it that it almost invites comparison with the Greek tragedy. Metamorphosis is undoubtedly one of Kafka's greatest contribution to modern literature. And this is followed by the short story called Judgment, which again arose from his private neurosis. In the heart of the story, you have this father-son conflict. This failing revolt against filial authority. Actually, 3 of his stories center around the theme of parental tyranny and abortive attempt at rebellion. Metamorphosis, the Judgment, and the Stalker. The Stalker, which is part of the unfinished novel America, but which has been published separately. The Judgment is perhaps much more intriguing than the Metamorphosis. For example, in the story Judgment, you have reference to the hero of the novel is called Benjamin, Georgy Benjamin. He has a friend in Russia. There is a passing reference to October Revolution in that novel, passing reference, but a significant allusion. Why does his father oppose his engagement? Why is his father obsessed with this distant friend of his son? Those puzzles remain unclear till the end of the novel. And when the short story ends, you find Benjamin's father cursing him. You will die by death by drowning. That's a punishment given to him. And then you suddenly find him, flying across the streets. Suddenly flying in a surreal sort of image. Kafka shows him flying through streets and ending up in a river. And Kafka in his diary says that he had ejaculation when he finished that story. It's a story which he finished in one sitting during night. He calls it an indubitable masterpiece. There are surely, sexual undercurrents the way the story ends. But then there are so many puzzling elements in that story. But at the heart of the story is the father situation which Kafka had endured in his life. The father sitting in judgment of his son. The father seen as an opposing self, as an opposing self. The father who is ununderstanding, unsympathetic. And the son unable to go against the wishes of his father. The son feeling cowed down by his father's authority. Both in Metamorphosis and the short story Judgment, you have this classical statement of the father-son conflict, which was at the center of many Jewish families in Kafka's time. In fact, there is a well-known essay by I forget the name of the critic. Kafka, a descending view. Kafka, a descending view. Where he says Kafka lacked the courage to rebel against his father. He says that the odds were heavily against Kafka in social life, in personal life. As I told you, he was right from the beginning discouraged, disaffected, denationalized. The cards were all stacked against him. But he lacked the courage to rebel. But that's a fact. That's a fact which is understood by Camus as well. He gave up too easily. He lacked the courage to rebel against parental authority. Yeah, there's a well-known article called Kafka, a Descending View, where he draws attention to Kafka's neurosis and his inability to rebel against his parental authority. But three of his stories, Judgment, the Metamorphosis, and the Stalker, center around the question of filial revolt. There is another story by Kafka. He wrote the story when he was dying, called A Hunger Artist. A Hunger Artist. A true masterpiece, a true masterpiece. Again, it's in the realm of fantasy. It's about an artist who goes into fasting before the public. He takes up fasting because he likes it. That's his way of expressing himself. He fasts for 40 years before the public. And there was a time when, the public used to admire him. The spectacle of a lean artist fasting scrupulously for 40 days, abstaining from food. But then times changed. He became more and more insecure. Finally, he became part of a circus. He was put inside a cage, covered by straw, and he went on fasting. Again, the short story writer underscores the fact that this was not done under compulsion. Fasting was the only form of self-expression he knew. He went on fasting without counting the number of days. Finally, he dies, and his dead body is thrown out of the cage. When the short story ends, you find a panther having entered the cage instead of the spectacle of the fasting artist. A panther leaping with vigor and joy. A panther who captured the attention of the public. He became a substitute for the unwanted spectacle of the hunger artist. It's a wonderful story, a hunger artist. And that story has been rightly interpreted as a parable of the alienation of the artist in modern times. And the relation between the artist and the public. There was a time when, the public wanted to see this hunger artist with his scrupulous adherence to the act of fasting for 40 days. But then, over a period of time, their taste changed. And when the story ends, they are really caught up with the spectacle of a panther leaping with vigor and joy instead of this pale, sickly artist who had by then died and whose dead body was thrown out. So the changing attitudes of the reading public towards the writer or the artist. And again, fasting is a metaphor. Fasting is a metaphor for an artist's absolute commitment to art. His sense of self-sacrifice, his absolute, unwavering commitment to the act of writing, to art. The entire story is, fantastic. You can't think of a man, fasting for 40 days. You can't think of a hunger artist put up in a cage. The whole thing is phantasmagoric. But then, underlying that story, there is this sense of the idea of the alienation of the artist in modern times. People's tastes have changed. People have new avenues of entertainment. The spectacle of a panther leaping with joy is much more fascinating than the sight of an emaciated man who goes on for fasting endlessly. So the changing attitudes of readers in Europe in the last 2 centuries towards the artist, towards the act of writing, towards art, that is subtly mirrored in this novel. Again, the hunger artist is a symbol of the artist or a symbol of the mystic or a prophet who meets with a tragic end. That is perhaps the last masterpiece that Kafka wrote, A Hunger Artist by Kafka. So these multi-layered stories, throw light on the metaphysical concerns of Kafka. The unease, that ate into his spirit, spilled over in various directions. There was a time when Kafka was described as a satirist in the manner of Gogol, as a critic of bureaucracy. But that's an extremely insular reading. Certainly, bureaucracy and the labyrinthine bureaucracy, the maze-like structure of the bureaucracy certainly plays a part in Kafka's novels. But that doesn't sum up the true spirit of Kafka's works. Bureaucracy, like the tyrannical father, forms part of a metaphor. My own belief, my own reading is that the decadent bureaucracy and the domineering father fused into the image of authority with capital A in Kafka's fiction. Authority which is always blocking your way. You have to define yourself vis-a-vis this authority. Again, there is no grace about the castle divine grace about the castle in Kafka's novel. The castle is decadent, and K has to use women as ploys as part of his attempt to get entry into the castle. So it is not a story of a spiritual quest. It is not a novel in the spirit of Pilgrim's Progress. So even God in Kafka's novels, is sometimes seen as malevolent, malignant, hostile. The God of vengeance, the God of vengeance in the ancient Jewish sense. So, a lone, morbid genius who had almost everything, going wrong in his life, his private life, possessing an uncanny insight into the shape of things to come. That in a way sums up Kafka's legacy, if at all you can call it a legacy. I told you it's not a comforting legacy. Kafka undercuts your easy optimism. He undercuts your easy optimism. He doesn't offer any shortcuts. Kafka tells you in his own way that you have to meet with these impediments, these hurdles which block your way. That to reach your destination is not easy. There is always this unfathomable distance between the individual and his goal, whatever it is. And Kafka, the seeker, the traveler, never arrives in his destination. It is a theme of non-arrival, He never arrives at his destination. He is either held back or he is lured in different ways, but he never arrives. That's why critics have spoken about the theme of non-arrival in Kafka. So in my own way, I was trying to disentangle part of what's called the Kafka mystery. I know it's rather foolish to disentangle that. The mystery will always remain as it is. It's a mystery which nobody can decipher properly. He remains inscrutable, somewhat incomprehensible. You can go on reading him, go on interpreting him, go on analyzing him, but there is something unanalyzable, something that just can't be revealed in his writings. And that's where Kafka's enduring appeal lies. He has been not only translated, but read in almost all world languages. I told you, writing secondary sources on Kafka can fill whole libraries in Prague. Again, during my visit to Prague, I made a strange discovery. Prague is full of castles. Even though Kafka's castle is of a different kind, is imaginary. But Prague is full of castles. Castles are a fascinating spectacle for tourists in Prague, the city of Prague. So, M. Govindan, who had visited Prague long ago, had told me that I had seen Kafka's Prague. It is not Kafka's Prague, but there are several, Kafka's castle, but there are several castles in Prague. Prague is full of castles. Maybe that provided the basis of the metaphor of the castle. But then in Kafka's fiction, the castle is unreachable. It's beyond your reach. It's something, that recedes into the mist. That's something which goes on tantalizing you, baffling you. you will never be able to enter there. So, we are dealing with we are dealing with a writer who undercuts all our shallow optimism, our easy confidence, and makes you take a hard look at this rather mysterious, unanalyzable phenomenon called human existence. It's the sense of human predicament that Kafka embodied in his writings with utmost honesty, with scrupulous care. Thank you.